Hi everyone, my name is Michelle Connor. I am the training manager here at B2W. It looks like some folks are still filtering in, so I'll start the introductory portion and then get into the meat of it as we've got everybody here. The purpose of this session, less talking about things inside of B2W software itself, but in today's session we're going to be talking about how to set up a really effective cost code structure for you and your company, hopefully something that works on a lot of different levels for everybody from the field to accounting, the executive group, and everyone in between. And I'm going to talk about some of the tips and tricks on how to get there as well. Non-specific to the different accounting packages, just a general overview of what makes that system work well. So my name is Michelle Connor. I am the training manager, as I mentioned, and joined with me today is Sean Borys, our senior training specialist. He's been a road warrior for about 15 years now with the company. I've been, once upon a time, I was an implementer here. I became a traveling trainer for a while. I'm now the training manager. So my perspective on this is coming in contact with a lot of different companies and a lot of different company setups. And very, very often we have conversations while we're setting up track, while we're setting up estimate on what's not working for a company, their current job cost ID system, what goals they really want to get out of it. And it's very often that companies aren't getting what they need. So for any of you guys who are coming, you're maybe coming from a program like QuickBooks that doesn't have job costing and you're setting up for the first time, people who are transitioning it to new accounting packages, hopefully we'll give you guys something to step away with here. Even if you're changing up your old codes inside of the new system, talking about how to make it all work and how to make it come together. Sean will be monitoring the questions queue. For anybody who has any questions, you can put one in there. And if we don't get to it during the session today, then we will follow up with you guys afterwards. So getting right into it, what makes a good cost code structure? And the first thing that I want to talk about, and I'll bring up several times, is that the number one mistake I see most companies make is they make a much too detailed list of job cost IDs, at least for coming out of the gate. There's a temptation involved when there's all this information that you realize that you could potentially gather, and they make a cost code for every one of those things that it might be interesting to know. And that leads to problems in terms of the logistics of the field actually reporting on it, accounting having to correct those things along the way, and sometimes it's just too much for an initial rollout. One thing to bear in mind is it is always easier to add cost codes after you've set up a system than it is to backtrack them out. Just like our B2W products, once you have a time card, an invoice charged to something, there's a receipt against this certain cost code, it's going to be difficult to remove it from the system. So it's always easier to add. I strongly recommend start general, and you can make it more specific as you go. Another general rule is sometimes people will just go through and they'll go, 1 to 99. Here are all of our cost codes. You want to have the codes structured in such a way that it makes it really easy to find things together. For example, if I have a header for 10,000 and I know that anything under 10,000 is general site conditions or is mobilization, and everything 20,000 is going to be some version of earthwork, I can look at a code and understand what it is without having to really memorize 99 things. I can memorize, 8 or 9 high level ideas and have some level of understanding as to what I'm looking at. And then what works for one company is not going to work for everyone. And that's one of the trickiest things with job cost IDs is there's no book out there that somebody could hand you and say, if you set it up exactly like this, then your company will be successful. Because everybody's coming from a different level of information that they're reporting already. Everybody's coming from a different level of expertise. People will have different accounting packages. So some people might have 1,000 codes and that works for them. And some people might have 20 and that works even better. So my goal today is to help you guys try and figure out what that sweet spot might be for your company by giving you some of the tools to think about it in an appropriate way. So before we jump all the way into it, just to get everybody on the same page with some of the terms that we're going to be using, job cost IDs are obviously referring to those job costing levels in the system. In B2W estimate, we call those job cost IDs all the way through, no matter where they show up in the cost structure. It's referred to as a job cost ID because that's generally the most generic terminology. And no matter the accounting package, it's more of an industry term. Specific to B2W track, which is kind of the angle that a lot of you are probably coming at this from if you're using this alongside B2W products, as you spend more of your time in track. And in the operational suite track schedule maintain, we call them account IDs, and specifically referring to essentially the buckets of money, the budgets, the account levels that these job cost IDs refer to, as opposed to something that identifies an organization, something that identifies an employee, the account level. And all the different accounting packages are going to have different terminology for this. They might call them phases or phase codes or cost codes or activities. We're not going to go through what these all mean in each of these different ones, but regardless of what your accounting calls it, we're talking about essentially the same concept here. What are those high level accounts and job cost IDs to which we're coding all of our man hours, all of our equipment time, all of our costs from a job? So when you go to set up a new structure, the steps that you're going to take along the way are generally going to be starting out with the goals. You want to know exactly what it is that you want to get out of the system, because again, going back to that concept that people will often make too big of a system to start, people will start to answer questions using job cost IDs that no one was asking. Nobody really needed to know the difference between 2-inch pipe and 4-inch pipe, but there's a code for both of them, and now that's something that's going to be in your system forever. Maybe it's enough to say that everything up to 12 inches falls under the same code because it's generally the same. And identifying your goals outright is going to help you with that. What don't we know and what are we trying to get to? Then you're going to identify everybody who's going to help you get to that list, whether it be executive members or accounting members or even field employees. Planning it out somewhere that's flexible, usually Excel or something that people can view and visualize the structure together. And then taking a final look at it, trying not to overthink it, step away from it, come back into it, take a look. And then finally, a couple tips on how to implement it and bring it together, and things that I've seen make companies successful when they choose to roll it out. So on that concept of identifying your goals, the main thing here is identifying what problems is the new system here to solve. Again, whether you're going from one accounting package to a new one, or this is your first foray into having job cost IDs, there's that temptation to get all of the possible information that you can out of these codes. Wouldn't it be really cool if I could see the difference between this and this and this? But really just focus on the things that you can't answer right now. If you're at a point in your systems where you really only know if you made or lost money at the picture level of the job, but you don't know how the individual items or the individual activities went, then you probably don't need 1,000 cost code system to get you to have more information than you had today. Your goal should then be being able to differentiate between, okay, well, how did the paving go versus how did the grading go? That would be a good start, as opposed to knowing the difference all the way down through. And another one, when identifying those goals, something that this really helps with is it helps provide buy-in for everybody along the way. If you switch over systems or you create more work for people in the field and down the line, and you don't tell them why they have to do this work, it's going to lead to resentment. It's going to lead to friction along the way. When people don't understand why they're performing something, they're not going to see the reason in it, and they're probably not going to be as diligent about it. And this is pretty often neglected. People will either not vet things with their field team, or they won't tell them why they're switching or what they're going to get out of it. And if you can identify goals early on and then share those with your organization and let them know, hey, the reason why we're going to have you start breaking out your time, instead of just telling me that you worked 8 hours today, you're going to tell me that you worked 4 hours on this and 2 on this and 2 on this. Tell them what you're going to get out of that, and by extension, what they're going to get out of that by making your company successful along the way. So having the goals up front, being able to tell them, hey, this is why we're going this route and all the good things it's going to do for us, is really important for kicking this off. It keeps you on track with how specific you need to be, and it gets everybody on the same page. And going back to that question of goals, start with, if you aren't sure exactly what information you need, like I mentioned, start with what you know now and where are the problems there? Where are the gaps? And there are all kinds of questions that this could answer. What activities are making me or losing me money? I want my bidding to be more accurate at this point. I want to learn what my true production rates are. And then I want to be able to plan those production rates. I want to be able to go into a job on Monday and say, these are the things that we need to complete and how much each day in order to set myself up to be finished by Thursday at 1. That's information that you build up to. So if you guys are at bullet point number 2 and you're still just trying to figure out what makes or loses you money, it's probably a mistake to try and learn all of these things at once, because you're going to end up with what's likely too many codes for you and your company. Too much information coming in, too much effort required to get there based on where you're at right now. Because you can always make this process more complicated as you go, but introduce it very simply. So posing these questions to the group as you guys are setting this up and looking at what it's going to turn into, you're going to want to be focused on how is it going to fit into your accounting practices. A lot of the perspective from project managers is going to be focused on how this fits into the jobs, but there are also certain things that accounting might need to know when auditing comes around, when they have to track PTO. So how is what we're trying to do going to fit into either the current accounting package that we have or the functionality that we're gaining in a new accounting package, if that's why you're creating codes? And what do we need to know for this to absolutely have to work? What is the bare minimum of information that is, if we don't have this, then the whole thing was for nothing? And that's where you should start with making the codes and deciding what needs to be where. If we don't understand the difference between what we do for concrete paving and what we do for asphalt paving and which one makes us more money, then this whole thing was a bust. Then that's a good place to start with, where you're going to create a distinction. I'm going to have a category for concrete. I'm going to have a category for asphalt. And then how do you plan to use that information that you gather to compare it to what you're doing in your projects? How is that going to help you improve how you're working your jobs in the day-to-day? And then when you're looking at it over a broader stream, what kind of lessons are you going to get out of it to move forward with? So going forward, I know that I would bring this one up again. Keep it simple. The number one mistake that I see, the number one thing that people will introduce a new list of cost codes, and then they'll come back and they'll say, you know, I just couldn't get my field guys to report on it, or, you know, we only use half of these because accounting was spending so much time fixing people's timesheets anyways that it wasn't worth it. It's always going to be easier for you to add in codes than it is to pull them out. And the way that I really talk to people about getting their head around this is hopefully you'll have this system for a very long time. Hopefully you're not doing all this work so that you can change again in 2 years. This is going to be what you use and what you build upon for a long time. So as you think about all those years of having all these codes, and you think about every man hour it will take for somebody in the field to choose between 2 different codes, choosing between A and B, an estimator having to code something, is this A or is this B, maybe payroll having to fix that number once it comes to them or fix where it's assigned to. Will you make more money by knowing the difference in how you perform A and how you perform B than you lost money in the man hours spent to assign and correct the codes? If having another level of codes is not going to save you time and make you money by understanding your business better, it's probably not worth having the code. Even if it might be cool to know the information, it's going to be problematic for the field to gather that level of detail. So that's something that hopefully helps people wrap their minds around what's too specific, what's not specific enough. Do I need to understand for a business reason, for understanding my costs and my productions, the difference between A and B? If the answer is yes, then they each deserve a separate code. And if the answer is no, they can be at the same level together. And I also mentioned before, identifying shareholders. Who's going to be involved in this project? And again, another mistake I commonly see is that companies will leave this at their executive level and they'll leave it at the accounting level. They don't take the time to bring in project managers, and most neglected of all are the guys in the field who are actually performing this work. They say that this is an accounting function and it's all of accounting's time going towards it. But having that other perspective will oftentimes give you and your company information about, okay, what are the actual logistics of someone having to break down this information into these multiple levels? If I give somebody 60 different codes for pipe work, what does that look like for a foreman when he goes to fill out his time and the time of his crew? What does it look like for the estimator who has to decide where all these different codes go? What does it look like to a project manager who's trying to figure out how they're doing if that's broken out 60 different ways? And a lot of times they'll be able to tell you pretty reliably, well, you're considering a code difference here, but there's no difference in the work. It doesn't make a difference if my trench is 8 inches deep or if it's 12 inches deep, other than that I'm moving more earth around. It matters once you get to a certain depth and you have to build a shelf and then things start to change, but up until then, it's more or less the same. That kind of perspective can be really important, and it also goes back to that concept of applying a sense of ownership and getting buy-in from the team. If your company knows that you've been bringing in PMs and you've been bringing in foremen to help you design this in a way that also works for the field, they're probably going to be more likely to accept it, not only as a necessary function, but as something that they feel like they helped with, even if it wasn't them specifically, knowing that their voices were heard in developing it. Because it's not just an accounting function. If to get information into your job costs, accounting structure, you need that information from the field. You need it from the PMs. You need the estimators to be able to assign it. So it all comes together. So having a well-rounded team is probably going to get you a list that's a little more realistic in what you can actually capture, and that's a little, generally speaking, a little less specific than what accounting might come up with on their own, but that's usually a good thing. and you can always add into it as time goes on. And when it comes to the planning phase, anything that lets you and the group visualize it together is generally a good way to set it up. I've seen people use Excel very frequently. I've seen people use PowerPoint to create hierarchies, the chart views that you can add in there to see how things group together. Just make it something that's easy to visualize and it's easy to edit and talk about and make changes to before you bring it into the accounting system or before you bring it into a field tracking system. Make sure that it's someplace that you can really play with it. And it doesn't all have to happen in a day. Remember to take a step back and ask yourselves those questions again. Hey, am I going to make any money by knowing the difference between these two numbers? Or is this just for the sake of knowing it? Or, does it make sense for my fields to report on these numbers? And the answer might even be, this isn't specific enough. We had one category for all of our earthwork, and I really think that we should be breaking it down into different levels, more specific. And there is such a thing as overthinking these codes. And again, overthinking tends to lead into adding more of them. That's another reason to step away. When people start talking in circles and they're talking over each other and it starts to get heated because these are important to the business, step back, come back at it with fresh eyes at another time, and make sure that everybody's on board with it, that everybody got their thing that they said that they had to have in order for this to be successful, that that's included in the system by the end of it. And when you're going through and implementing this new system, another thing that I see a lot of companies do is they introduce it gradually. They say, well, we're going to let people use their old time cards where they didn't have to put things into job cost IDs, or we're going to let them use the paper version where they just write it in and they don't have to divide it out. Just for a few weeks, and if they want to use the new system, they can. And generally speaking, of course, every company is different, but generally speaking, if some of those field personnel have the option to not do something that's new and harder, they're not going to do the thing that's new or harder. And for some companies, what that means is because there's no hard shutoff date, they just keep doing it the old way indefinitely. Even if someone tells them, hey, you should really be moved on to this new thing that we're doing, it becomes someone else's job to put their time to the appropriate codes, their costs into the appropriate places. Where do we get these materials and what account do they go to? So having a hard go live date and again, explaining to people why you're going to do it, what it's going to get them, teach them how to use it, but then say, starting Monday, this is the only option. That tends to have higher success than having a soft, hey, you guys can do it this way if you want, but we aren't going to make you for another month. Have a date where everything's good to go and you start it up. And you can always, if you determine as you're doing this that you really do need more information than you have right now, it's easy to create a code and say, hey, when you have a differentiation between these two or these four, these however many factors, you're going to need to break it out into this level. It's very simple to add and then to bring things out afterwards, to remove information later on. So I wanted to show you guys, as we went through, a couple examples. This has all been abstract so far, and we've been talking about what it means to have a system, but I wanted to show you guys what some of those systems might be. So I prepared a couple sets of examples right here. And the first one that I did is trying to take our minds directly out of construction for a second. I have the hobby of detailing cars. I really, really like I'm kind of a perfectionist. I like having things very clean. I like having things organized. I like having things together. So in my spare time, I detail cars. And that can be a pretty expensive hobby if you let it go. because there's a lot of high-end products that you can get and things that you can do. So I thought to myself, if there's a way for me to track this, like I always ask my customers to track what they're doing, maybe I won't spend as much money on it. So what we're looking at right now, this higher level here, is what the high level codes are that represent groupings inside of this job cost ID setup. And the first thing that a grouping does is, like I said before, it makes it really easy to recognize everything that's underneath it. If I see something with a leading 1, I know that it belongs to prep and material because they've all got that. I've broken it down that way. And if I see something with a 4, I know it's related to something having to do with the wash, and so on and so forth, all the way down through. These are, car washing is a little different because there are obvious steps. It's generally going to happen in the same order, but you buy materials, you get everything set up, you clean out your interior, you rinse off your car, you wash it, you rinse it off again, you make it dry, and then maybe you polish it, maybe you clean your windows, you do whatever else is involved. It goes A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And that's what these numbers here represent. And the other thing with this is that it makes it really easy if not only can I visually see this, but a lot of accounting packages and a lot of these field tracking programs you guys might be using support something called wildcard reporting. So if I wanted to see, instead of each of these things individually, if I just wanted to run a report on everything I've spent on prep, I can just search the 1, and then I can randomize. I can say any other numbers under here will also qualify for this search, or anything that has 3 and then 4 numbers after it. And I can get a report on all these things without having to add them to a report individually. In this example, it's at total 8 different items in my biggest breakdown. But for a lot of you guys, that might include hundreds of items under one section. And having numbers that very clearly represent that category is going to help you with that reporting and make it a lot easier to see things at an overarching level that are inclusive of the items we say underneath them, categorized at a child level, and then this being my parent level. And you can see I go into different levels of detail on my different areas. There are a lot of different things that you can get for cleaning a car, and a lot of different brushes you can get, and a lot of different products. But I didn't want to put polishes, and I didn't want to put soaps, and I didn't want to put clay bars and sprays and all these different things in all these different categories. To me, it was enough to know, hey, how much did I spend on product? How much did I spend on my actual brushes, and how much did I spend on sponges and the sheepskin gloves that you use to wash everything off? So this represents something kind of taken outside of that job cost ID construction context. And going back into a construction context, another example of a simple list for job cost IDs would be something like this. I've got general conditions up here, and everything under general conditions starts with a 1. I've got my mobilization. I might have temporary fences up here. I might have cleaning stations up here. Anything that relates to sort of my miscellaneous bucket for the site. It's related to my setup. It's related to the overall job. And then I've got clearing and demo, and I've got earthwork, and I've got concrete, and I've broken these down into different levels. But again, this comes back into the question of, for some of your companies, just knowing that you have an area for concrete flat work is going to be enough. And for some people, you're going to say, well, no, there's lots of different kinds that we do, or we also do flat work isn't enough to cover all the kinds of paving that we do with concrete. But this is where it comes into question what level of detail to go into beyond this. So I see a lot of people make distinctions based on the depth or the width or some other factor that generally doesn't have a lot of bearing on how the work is performed. If you're doing a sidewalk and it's 4 inches thick at regulation, or it's 6 inches thick because that city asked you to, is not usually gonna make too much difference between how the work is being performed. Similar to the idea if I'm running conduit and it's 2 inches or it's 3 inches, there's more work of some degree happening for one for the other, and they're technically different materials, but they're not usually a very different process overall. The things that you should be worried about are when does the work change? So having to flush a pipe, inspect a pipe, and then line a pipe is a different process than putting different sizes of pipe in the ground. And that's a place where it might make sense to add a code, as opposed to just having a code for every single incremented size of pipe. Or one that I see more often that tends to work better for companies is they'll do categories. Hey, it doesn't make too much difference up to 12 inches. And then anything between 1 foot and 3 feet in pipe width is close enough that we're going to get the information that we need. And then it's anything that's wider than 3 feet is when we really want to see it as an individual item. So again, this one's pretty simple. I want to give you guys an example of a more complex list, one that's got some more breakdowns than the one that I just showed you. You can see that this one has a lot more distinctions along the way. And let me zoom that in one more time, just for anybody who's having difficulty seeing it. But you can see everything's still broken out into these categories. And again, for my reporting, I could search anything with a 2 and then know that that's going to be related to earthwork. If I search something with a 2, 3, and then 3 other numbers, it's going to be related to my detail excavation. So even if I never actually search the number 23000, I'm going to get all of that information qualified underneath it. So that's another one. And that's really just to avoid doing something like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 5, all the way down through every code you could have, because then they're not going to be grouped in this way. And this also makes it really simple. If you can see the way I have this one set up, or this one set up with the 5 numbers, it makes it easy. If I want to add another code in here, I just make a 2400. Or if I decide that there's 6 different kinds of structure demo, I can say 23100, 23200, 23300, so on. So having this list in here really helps with the organization, understanding what something is just by looking at it without having to know every single subdivision. And it's going to keep everything sorted together in the list as well. When you guys are using these inside of software packages, they're going to be sorting either on the name or they're going to be sorting on the number. And by having the number be something that's easy to understand, it's going to make it a lot easier for you to find things once it's being fully utilized. And I haven't seen any questions pop up yet. If anybody has any on kind of this setup portion, this would be a good time to ask those. Otherwise, we can move back into the PowerPoint area. So again, some general tips, kind of an overview of what we've been talking about is you want to avoid anything that's got a leading 0 in it. So in that list, you noticed I didn't have a section that was 0000, because when you're importing it, when you're exporting it, when you're passing files back and forth for payroll and things like that, anything that's related to Excel will tend to delete that leading 0, and you'll end up with just the numbers that showed up after that. So I always recommend starting with a 1 and going up from there in the count as you go. We've talked about a couple times how having things under similar number sets makes it a lot easier for that reporting. It makes it a lot easier for sorting for a number of things. And all of my examples used 5 numbers. It's a good number for having a lot of space to add codes as you go and as you grow. But I've seen a lot of companies use alphanumerics. They put in the beginning of it. It's EXC if it's excavation, and then it's 100, 200, 300. The only thing you want to bear in mind there is make sure that your accounting package can support if you're going to try and use alphanumerics, or make sure that there's not a character limit on how many actual digits you can have in that account code. And you want to also be careful of special characters, using dashes, using periods, using any kind of punctuating mark between things can confuse some of these systems, as opposed to you're usually pretty safe if you're just using numbers. And for some of you who are using a system like possibly Viewpoint, you might have multiple, when you're coding things, you might actually have multiple codes that go together and get exported in different ways. But that is going to be decided based on what your package can support. And generally, there's too many of them right now to go through for me to give any specifics for you guys on what would support what and what wouldn't. But just something to bear in mind. And anybody who's helping you implement those packages should be able to answer that question for you pretty easily. And the other thing, this steps out a little bit from the idea of job cost IDs and goes into the field reporting side of it. But generally speaking, when you're setting up a job cost ID, you're also setting up a unit of measure that's associated with it, at least when we're talking about the field reporting side, which I know many of you, if you're using our products and you're concerned about job cost IDs, you're probably using B2W track, or you're using B2W schedule, and you're using production rates. When you start to assign those job cost IDs a unit of measure, it usually helps to avoid lump sums for an account level. It makes it easier for you as a company to compare how things have gone if you can have a consistent unit of measure as a point of reference. Our average cost per square foot across the past 6 months has been X, or on this job, we've been able to report Y for this. Lump sums, and I see this especially with mobilization, instead of treating it by the load or by the each or by any other kind of number, it's difficult for the field to report on, and it doesn't give you a lot of great information when you're looking at the codes. So something to bear in mind, especially when you're pulling it into whether it be B2W track or any other kind of field tracking application, try and assign something that's relatively universally understandable and apply square footage or cubic yards or cubic meters, whatever you're working with, to that system to make it a little easier. And I did see, we did get one question down there that I can see, and it's whether or not people will have access to the recording. And yes, you guys will all be sent a link once we have it posted up online. It will be hosted on our site, and you guys will be able to access this after the fact. And going into kind of review of we've brought up a lot of information. We've talked about a couple things. The most important ones to bear in mind are try and keep it simple when you're starting out. There's this huge temptation once you realize that there's information that you can get to want it all. But remember the logistics of the field. Remember to include them in the process. And remember that idea that if it's not going to make me more money by understanding this difference by adding a code, then it will cost me to apply this code over and over and over again throughout the years. It's probably not worthwhile to use that and create a division there. You probably want to keep it at one, and you can always expand out and add others. Another reason why it's good to use that structure that lets us do wildcard reporting, even if you spent a year reporting something under 11000 and then you make it 11100 and 11200, you can still use that top level to compare them together, and then going forward you can see them individually. And again, it's very frequent that when companies start this rollout, when they start this process, they do not ask their team members for buy-in. They don't talk to the foreman, they don't talk to the PMs and explain why it is that they're making this change. They don't explain to them what they're going to get out of it. Generally speaking, your foreman, your project managers, your field supervisors, everybody wants the company to do well because that's good for them too. And if you can give them a reason why their extra work is going to make you do better as a company, they'll probably decide to go along with you, as opposed to just rolling out the process and saying that it's something that you need from them. And don't be afraid to iterate before you pull that final trigger. Don't be afraid to come back at it with fresh eyes and decide to make it a little more expansive or reel it back in some once you guys have had more meetings, once you guys have had some time away from it, and are able to look at it from a fresh perspective. And so our next one here is the question slide. I see that we got one for, can I briefly discuss the estimating at a more detailed level and what you may need to track in the field? So, and remember that I'm talking about this mostly from the perspective of exporting something from B2W Estimate, a bid that you have won, into our B2W track system. When you do that, you have the option to create anything that you want to track at a job level and have the field report on. You can apply one of these codes in the estimate and send it across into B2W track. And that will give the foreman or the field supervisors, whatever level are creating field logs for you, it will give them the pick list of the things that they can say that they worked on for this job. So they can say, yep, I can see that we've got 2 different areas where you're concerned about for paving, and I'll distinguish between those. I've got 6 different items for piping. I've got 1 item for earthwork. Whatever the breakdown is, coding it in B2W Estimate defines it in B2W track. And if the question's a little broad, so I'll stay a little broad right here unless I get some clarification. But essentially, the estimators in most companies that I see are the ones who are creating that coding level, and that requires some level of talking back and forth in terms of they need to understand the codes and they need to understand how the field will track it. So, and another reason why you can keep your codes relatively simple is you might have just one code for, let's say, all of your asphalt paving is under one code, but you're on a job where you have 3 or 4 different streets that you want to track very carefully, or you've got an off ramp and you've got a highway that you're doing and you want to track those separately. The system going from B2 Estimate to B2W track will allow you to use the same code and create different areas that you're recording that in, but your accounting is still just going to recognize that one code. You can say that there are 6 areas you want the foreman to report on, but all of their time ends up in that bucket. So that's really what I mean when I say that the estimating is involved in this and they may need to track it in the bid. They're going to be assigning those codes based on what the outcomes are the company wants to know from the job. So that might be help from the PM to make them come to that decision. Some of your estimators might also be project managers. And that's where that information is coming from. And that feeds back into that same idea of you don't want people to have to report against the lump sum. So how you bid directly impacts how you're reporting and recording this information inside of B2W track. Because if you put all of your paving under one item and there were no distinctions, then it doesn't give the field person the flexibility to have those different items to report against. So one of those definitely does feed the other. And it's the other reason why you want buy-in, you want your estimators to be on board and to understand what's happening within the system. All right. So we are coming right up on 1:45 here. If anybody has a couple more questions, I can stay and answer those. Just so everyone's aware, our next webinar that will be coming up is going to be on August 20th, which will be on our B2W Maintain program, managing parts and inventory within a maintenance software. For B2W specifically, we've added some exciting new functionality to that in the past year to make you guys aware of, and just an overview of best practices for that, how it all comes together. And one more question that we got that I've got time for: on the track side, do these roll up under the production accounts? So talking about B2W track and the terminology that we use inside of there, that yes, these production accounts are based on the job cost IDs that are being set up. And again, the flexibility of having it come from track means that I could have, again, if I were identifying all of my earthwork under 20,000, but I had several areas in my bid with earthwork in them and I wanted to track them separately, I can have several production accounts inside of that job that represent 20,000, but it can be 20,000 A, 20,000 B, 20,000 C. It will not confuse your accounting package, but it allows you the ability to be more specific on that job without building a huge cost code structure. And the recording for this will be available online. We can provide the Excel examples for everybody's reference too that I had pulled up here. And if you guys have any other questions, any other information that you want to seek out, here is our contact information for our sales department, who can help you guys with any product related questions. They can get you pointed in the right direction if you're not really sure where to direct a question that you have. And our support team, 24/7, 365 support for anybody who's under maintenance. They're a fantastic group, and if they can't answer your question, they can absolutely find the people who will be able to answer it for you. So yeah, expect that email with the recorded session once we have it posted. And thank you everybody so much for your time.